we are going to talk about a passage in which Jesus once again makes kind of a shocking statement about family. He also discusses the need to calculate the cost of following him. And he makes a few references to the inability to finish something that you've started. It seems to me that life is full of situations where we have to calculate the cost of something, right? If you own a home, you've had to calculate the cost of your mortgage. If you are going to purchase a car, make another major purchase in your life, then you want to sit and you want to figure out what that's going to cost you, not just up front, but how much it's going to cost you each month to make that mortgage payment or to make that car payment, to see if your personal finances can manage that purchase. Now, I think we also make calculations when we're making decisions in our lives. If you're deciding whether or not to go back to school, you have some calculations to make. Students, if you're deciding whether or not to go to school, you might be thinking about the cost of a state school versus a private school or a tech college. We also make some calculations when we're deciding on things like relationships, friendships, kind of those emotional calculations that we run through in our minds. Now, over the past few weeks, we have been discussing the occupation of crab fishing in relationship to our message series. And you know that those men who are going out fishing on the Bering Sea have to make some calculations in terms of the cost. We know that that job is dangerous. They have to determine whether or not it's worth risking their lives to go out and do this, because the other side of that is that it's very lucrative and they can make a lot of money for themselves and for their families. But they have to constantly have in the back of their mind that it is a job that might cost them their very lives. Now, when we are making the decision to follow Christ, we also have to make some calculations. We have to consider the cost. So let's see what Jesus has to say about that. We'll be looking at Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 35, a little bit longer passage today. And it says, "Now large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So then, none of you can be my disciple. Who does not give up all his own possessions. Therefore, salt is good, but even salt has become tasteless. With what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Now, Jesus has been teaching in parables in the previous chapter in Luke. If you would read on, he continues to teach in the same manner in the next chapter. And then in between, we get what almost seems like this out-of-place narration about discipleship. It's not out of place, though, when you consider the idea that verse 25 tells us large crowds were going along with him, crowds of people that were maybe still on the fence about whether or not they were going to follow him, who were weighing his words and considering what this decision might mean for their lives. And in these verses, he gives them, and therefore he gives us, a few almost mini parables to speak about the need to calculate the cost when deciding whether or not to follow him. And I believe that in these verses we can sort out three different costs that need to be calculated: the cost of priority, the cost of war, and the cost of perseverance. Now, Jesus repeats in these verses some things that he has already said about following him, things that we've already talked about through this series. He says, if you don't carry your own cross, you cannot be my disciple. If you don't give up all your possessions, you cannot be my disciple. But he makes here another very difficult statement about family, doesn't he? Let's look at that just a moment. He says, if anyone comes to me and doesn't hate, it's a very strong word, doesn't hate his father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers, his sisters, he's kind of including everybody there, even his own life, then he can't be my disciple. Now, isn't it interesting that the commandments, as well as places in the New Testament, tell us that we are supposed to honor our mother and father? How do you do that if you hate? Doesn't the New Testament talk to us about loving our neighbors as ourselves? But now he's telling us that we have to hate even our own lives. We read about things that are just contrary to this, don't we? So how are we to understand this text? Well, Jesus often has this way of using hyperbole. Does anybody remember high school English? Anybody remember what hyperbole is? Yes? Nobody wants to shout it out, though, because you don't want to get it wrong. It's an intentionally strong or exaggerated word or statement about something that's used to make a point. And that's what Jesus is doing here. And hate can actually be interpreted love less. Does that make sense? In other words, if you don't love your mother or your father or your sister or your brother or your wife or your children or your own life less than you love me, then you can't follow me. In other words, everything else takes second place to him. Do you remember in the Old Testament when we read that the Lord saw that Leah was hated? Do you remember that part, the story of Leah and Rachel? And we read that Leah was hated. She wasn't actually hated. She was loved less than Rachel was. It's the same concept here that Jesus is using. And his point is that anyone who chooses to follow him must love him more, infinitely more, abundantly more than every other person. And it's not necessarily putting him at the top of a priority list. I always think we get the wrong image there. If we have this list of priorities and we're putting Jesus at the top of it, he needs to be at the center of everything. Don't think of it like a list. Think of it like a wheel. And he needs to be at the center, and everything else in your life has to revolve around him and be anchored in him. If he's at the center, that means he's first, he's last, he's everywhere in between. He is all that matters to us, matters more than everything else and everyone else. He has to be loved more than your family. He has to be loved more than your comfort. That's a tough one. He has to be loved more than your desire for joy, for possessions, more than your free time, more than your job, more than your own life. I often think, we as Christians think, well, of course he's first in my life. I'm here. I'm sitting in church this morning. I did my Bible reading this week, and I checked it off every day. Spent my requisite 30 minutes a day in prayer. But if you really look back over your last week, just kind of think back a second to the last week of your life. Did you love him more than everything else? Maybe to figure that out, we need to decide what it looks like to love him more than everything else. Have you spent time in prayer? Some of you might be thinking, 30 minutes? I didn't even do 2. Have you spent time in his word? Have you loved your neighbor, whatever that looks like? Have you taken a meal? Have you raked leaves for somebody? Have you reached out to those in need? Have you praised him through the difficult times in your life? That's where it starts to get a little tougher to see how we're doing. Have you let him have control? Have you pushed your own will aside in favor of his will operating in your life? Have you worked to avoid sin, to become more like him? Now, ask yourself how you did with all of those things this week. Did you do those things? Then we can really say, did we choose to love him over everything else, over even ourselves? It's a cost that we have got to calculate. Now, the second cost that I believe the passage instructs us to look at is the cost of war. He says, which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he's strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one against him with 20,000, or else send a delegation to make peace? That's all war imagery. Did you get that when you read that? It's all war imagery. If you think that it's significant that Jesus taught in parables, and it is, you can look at this as kind of a mini parable of what he's talking about here. And he is using these war-laden images to talk about the cost of discipleship. Now, a tower, which we have an illustration of this morning. I really don't plan my messages around the scenery that Rangeline sets up. But we have a tower. I wouldn't advise using that tower for a place of refuge against an enemy because it looks a little weak. It's kind of coming apart at the bottom. But there's your tower. There's your image of the tower this morning. A tower was a place of defense. It's a place where you could go up really high in the tower and you could see the enemy coming. You could kind of make plans. You could get everybody into the tower to make sure that they were all going to be safe. They had to be built really strong in order to be able to stand up against the attacks of the enemy that was coming. Think of all of the places in Scripture where it talks about the Lord being our tower. We think of that as a place of safety, right? A place of refuge against the attacks. Now, likewise, he is talking about the king that's going to enter into battle. 10,000 going up against 20,000. That doesn't sound like very good odds. I'm not a math major. You all know that. But even that looks a little scary to me. It is his way of saying, this is about war. This is not an easy road. When you choose to follow me, and I have said this time and time again over these past few weeks, it is not all roses and sunshine and laughter and pretty birds singing. It is war. When you enter into a relationship with Jesus Christ, we need to remember and to acknowledge over and over and over again that we are entering into a battle that was waged since the beginning of time. It has been there all along, and it will go on until the end of the world. And for you personally, it will go on till the end of your life or until Jesus returns, whichever comes first. When you choose to follow him, you enter into a military state. And perhaps he intends to show us by the numbers that he uses, the odds that he uses, that the enemies that you will encounter are numerous. And they're strong. And it won't always look like the odds are in your favor. Have you weighed the cost of that? Hell and earth will join forces to destroy you. Have you felt that in your life?